Welcome back to Hold On, Survival Stories, where we explore the most extraordinary tales of human endurance, courage, and the unbreakable will to survive against impossible odds. I'm your host, and today's story will take you deep into the earth, into a world of absolute darkness, where time loses all meaning and hope becomes the only thing standing between life and death. Picture this: you're 400 feet underground in a narrow cave passage, exploring one of nature's most beautiful but dangerous environments. Suddenly, the ground beneath you gives way. You fall into a deep crevice, your leg trapped beneath a massive boulder that weighs more than a car. You're alone, in complete darkness, with no cell phone signal and no way to call for help. How long could you survive? How long before hypothermia sets in from the constant 50-degree cave temperature? How long before dehydration becomes fatal? How long before the crushing weight of rock and despair breaks not just your body, but your spirit? This is the true story of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a 31-year-old geologist, an experienced caver from Kentucky, who on October 3rd, 2021, entered Mammoth Cave National Park for what should have been a routine research expedition. Instead, she found herself trapped 400 feet underground for 127 hours, more than 5 days, in a race against time that would test every limit of human survival. Sarah's story isn't just about surviving in a cave. It's about the battle between rational thought and primal fear when you're buried alive in the Earth's depths. It's about the psychological challenge of maintaining sanity in absolute darkness and silence. It's about the moment when your scientific mind tells you that rescue is impossible, but your heart refuses to accept that calculation. But most importantly, it's about what happens when the darkness becomes so complete, so overwhelming, so eternal, that holding on to hope requires not just courage, but an act of pure faith. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been exploring caves for over 15 years. As a geologist specializing in karst formation, she had mapped underground systems across 3 continents and had survived equipment failures, flash floods, and navigation errors that would have been fatal for less experienced cavers. She understood the dangers of the underground world better than almost anyone, which makes what happened to her all the more terrifying, because if someone with Sarah's experience and expertise could find herself trapped hundreds of feet underground with no way out, it could happen to any cave explorer, no matter how prepared or experienced. October 3rd, 2021 was a perfect day for underground research. The weather above ground was stable, with no rain forecast that could create dangerous flooding conditions in the cave system. Sarah was conducting a geological survey in a remote section of Mammoth Cave, mapping limestone formations that had never been properly documented. Sarah's research required her to explore passages that were off-limits to tourists, narrow corridors and vertical shafts that only experienced cavers could navigate safely. She had proper equipment, extensive safety training, and a detailed plan that included emergency protocols and check-in times with the surface. But the Earth doesn't follow safety protocols. Limestone caves are dynamic environments where rock formations that have been stable for thousands of years can suddenly shift without warning. And sometimes, those shifts create traps that no amount of experience or preparation can anticipate. At 2:30 p.m. on October 3rd, while Sarah was documenting a previously unmapped chamber 400 feet below the Earth's surface, a section of cave floor that had supported countless explorers over the decades suddenly collapsed beneath her feet. Sarah fell 12 feet into a narrow crevice, her right leg becoming pinned beneath a limestone boulder that weighed approximately 800 pounds. The fall damaged her headlamp, leaving her in complete darkness. Her radio was crushed in the impact, cutting off all communication with the surface. And the cave system's natural acoustics meant that even if she screamed at the top of her lungs, no one would hear her from 400 feet underground. In an instant, Sarah Mitchell went from being an expert researcher conducting routine field work to a trapped victim fighting for survival in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. But Dr. Sarah Mitchell didn't give up, even when the darkness was absolute. even when the cold began penetrating her bones, even when the rational part of her mind calculated her odds of survival and found them virtually non-existent. This is the story of 127 hours trapped underground. This is the story of a woman who used her scientific knowledge, her caving experience, and her unbreakable determination to survive in conditions that should have been fatal. This is the story of holding on when the earth itself seems determined to bury you alive. This is Sarah's story. The morning of October 3rd began with Dr. Sarah Mitchell reviewing topographical maps and geological surveys in the research station at Mammoth Cave National Park. As a geologist specializing in karst formation, Sarah had been granted special access to explore and document areas of the cave system that were closed to the general public. Weather looks perfect for underground work, observed Dr. Mark Rodriguez, the park's chief geologist, as he reviewed Sarah's planned route for the day. No precipitation expected, stable barometric pressure, ideal conditions for deep cave exploration. Sarah's research project involved mapping previously undocumented limestone formations in what cavers called the deep zone passages that extended more than 300 feet below the surface and required advanced technical skills to access safely. The work was important for understanding the geological history of the region, but it was also inherently dangerous. I'll be following the established route through Devil's Throat to reach the target chamber, Sarah explained, tracing her planned path on the cave map. Estimated time underground is 6 hours, with surface check-ins scheduled every 2 hours. The safety protocols for deep cave research were extensive and strictly enforced. Sarah carried redundant lighting systems, emergency food and water, first aid supplies, communication equipment, and detailed maps of the cave system. She was also required to follow established routes and maintain regular contact with surface personnel. Remember, if you miss a check-in by more than 30 minutes, we initiate emergency protocols, Dr. Rodriguez reminded her. And if conditions change in any way, you abort the mission and return to the surface immediately. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of these safety procedures. Cave rescue operations were complex, dangerous, and time-sensitive. The best strategy was always prevention, avoiding situations that would require rescue in the first place. At 8:30 a.m., Sarah began her descent into Mammoth Cave through the research entrance, a narrow opening that provided access to the cave's deeper passages without disturbing tourist areas. The transition from daylight to the cave's eternal darkness was always psychologically challenging, even for experienced cavers. The first hour of Sarah's journey took her through familiar passages that she had explored multiple times during previous research trips. The highway, a wide, relatively flat passage that served as the main route to deeper areas, allowed for comfortable walking and good progress toward her target zone. 1 hour in, making good time, Sarah reported during her first scheduled check-in. Reached Junction 7, proceeding toward Devil's Throat. Conditions normal, no issues. Devil's Throat was a narrow, challenging passage that required technical rope work to navigate safely. It was a 200-foot vertical descent through a series of tight spaces and rocky shelves that demanded both physical skill and mental focus. Sarah had completed this route dozens of times, but it never became routine. The technical sections always require respect, Sarah muttered to herself as she rigged her rappelling equipment. Complacency kills cavers. The descent through Devil's Throat took 45 minutes of careful rope work and precise navigation. Sarah's headlamp illuminated the ancient limestone formations around her flowstone cascades, stalactites, and rock formations that had been shaped by millions of years of water flow. Beautiful formations down here, Sarah noted in her voice recorder as she documented her observations. Extensive flowstone development, probable Mississippian limestone, excellent preservation of original stratification. Sarah's scientific training made her appreciate the cave environment not just as a challenging physical space, but as a geological treasure that told the story of the Earth's history. Each rock formation, each mineral deposit, each structural feature provided clues about the processes that had shaped this underground world over eons. At the bottom of Devil's Throat, Sarah reached the entrance to the deep zone, the area of the cave system that extended below 300 feet depth and contained the undocumented formations she had come to study. This was where her serious research work would begin. 2 hours in, reached deep zone entrance, Sarah reported during her second check-in, beginning geological survey of target chamber. Everything proceeding according to plan. The target chamber was a large room, approximately 100 feet long and 50 feet wide, with a ceiling that soared 30 feet above the floor. It contained limestone formations that had never been properly mapped or studied, including what appeared to be rare mineral deposits that could provide valuable information about the cave's geological history. Sarah spent the next 2 hours methodically documenting the chamber's features, taking photographs, collecting mineral samples, and creating detailed notes about the rock formations she observed. It was painstaking work that required scientific precision and careful attention to detail. Incredible formations in here, Sarah recorded as she worked. Extensive gypsum flower development, possible rare mineral inclusions, definitely worth detailed study. This chamber is going to require multiple research trips to document properly. Sarah was so absorbed in her scientific work that she lost track of time. When she finally checked her watch, she realized she had missed her scheduled check-in by 20 minutes. Protocol required her to contact the surface immediately to report her status. Surface base, this is Sarah, she called on her radio. Sorry for the delayed check-in. Got absorbed in the geological survey. Everything's fine down here, but I'm running behind schedule. The response was immediate and concerned. Sarah, we were about to initiate emergency protocols. What's your current status and location? I'm in the target chamber, about 4 hours into the survey. The formations here are incredible, but they're taking longer to document than I expected. I'd like to extend my underground time by 2 hours to complete the initial survey. After a brief discussion, Sarah was granted permission to extend her underground time, but with strict conditions. She had to maintain hourly check-ins and return to the surface no later than 6:00 p.m. Understood, Sarah confirmed. I'll complete the survey and head back up. Should be on the surface by 6. It was a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, based on Sarah's experience and the stable conditions in the cave. But it was also a decision that would prove to have consequences that no one could have anticipated. Sarah continued her geological survey, moving to the far end of the chamber, where she had spotted some unusual rock formations that required closer examination. The area she was investigating was near the edge of the chamber, where the floor appeared to transition into a series of smaller passages and crevices. At 2:30 p.m., while Sarah was photographing a particularly interesting mineral formation, she stepped onto what appeared to be solid cave floor. The limestone beneath her feet looked identical to the rest of the chamber floor, stable, solid, and capable of supporting a person's weight. But appearances in caves can be deceiving. What Sarah had stepped onto was actually a thin limestone shelf that concealed a deep crevice below. The shelf had been weakened by thousands of years of water erosion, and Sarah's weight combined with her heavy research equipment was just enough to cause it to collapse catastrophically. The limestone shelf gave way with a sound like thunder echoing through the chamber. Sarah fell 12 feet into a narrow crevice, her right leg becoming wedged beneath an 800-pound boulder that had been dislodged by the collapse. The impact destroyed her headlamp, plunging her into absolute darkness. Her radio was crushed against the rock wall, cutting off all communication with the surface. In the space of 3 seconds, Dr. Sarah Mitchell went from conducting routine geological research to being trapped 400 feet underground with a crushed leg, no light, and no way to call for help. Sarah screamed into the darkness, though she knew rationally that no one could hear her from 400 feet below ground. "Somebody help me." But the only response was the echo of her own voice, bouncing off the limestone walls, a haunting reminder of how alone she was in the depths of the earth. Sarah was about to begin the fight of her life, and she didn't even know if anyone above ground realized she was in trouble. The darkness was absolute, not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom at night, where your eyes eventually adjust and you can make out shapes and shadows. This was the complete, overwhelming darkness of deep earth, where no light had ever penetrated, and no human eye could see anything, no matter how long they waited. Dr. Sarah Mitchell lay motionless in the narrow crevice, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The pain in her right leg was excruciating, a crushing sensation that told her immediately that bones were broken and soft tissue was severely damaged. But the physical pain was almost secondary to the terrifying reality of her situation. She was trapped 400 feet underground, pinned beneath a massive boulder, in complete darkness, with no way to communicate with the surface. Her scientific mind began calculating survival parameters automatically. Cave temperature, approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, high humidity, limited air circulation, no immediate access to food or water beyond what she carried in her pack. "Okay, Sarah," she said aloud, her voice shaking with pain and fear. "Think, assess the situation. What are your resources? What are your options?" Speaking aloud served two purposes. It helped her organize her thoughts rationally, and it provided human sound in the oppressive silence of the cave. Sarah had read about the psychological effects of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation, and she knew that maintaining verbal communication, even with herself, would be crucial for preserving her sanity. Sarah's first priority was determining the extent of her injuries. She couldn't see her trapped leg, but she could feel that circulation was compromised. Her foot was becoming numb, and she could detect the swelling that indicated internal bleeding and tissue damage. "Definitely broken," Sarah assessed clinically, trying to maintain professional detachment. "Probably multiple fractures, possible vascular damage, significant soft tissue injury. Without medical intervention, I'm looking at potential amputation or death from complications." But Sarah couldn't dwell on the medical implications. Her immediate concern was freeing herself from the boulder trap and finding a way to signal for rescue. She began exploring her situation by touch, using her hands to map the crevice that had become her prison. The space was narrow, perhaps 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. The ceiling was just high enough for Sarah to sit upright if she could manage the pain. The boulder pinning her leg was wedged between the walls of the crevice in a way that made it almost impossible to move without mechanical advantage. "Physics problem," Sarah muttered, drawing on her scientific training. "Need leverage, need fulcrum, need mechanical advantage. What do I have to work with?" Sarah's research pack contained various tools and equipment that might be useful for escape attempts. She had a rock hammer, measuring tape, sample containers, a notebook, emergency food bars, water bottles, and a small first aid kit. Nothing designed for moving 800-pound boulders, but potentially useful for creating leverage systems. Sarah's most pressing concern was the lack of light. Her primary headlamp had been destroyed in the fall, but she carried backup lighting in her pack. She managed to retrieve a small LED flashlight, and the sudden appearance of light in her prison was psychologically overwhelming. "Thank God," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face, as she saw her situation clearly for the first time. The reality was both better and worse than she had imagined. Better because the crevice was stable. There was no immediate danger of further collapse. The walls were solid limestone, and the boulder pinning her leg, while impossibly heavy, was securely wedged and unlikely to shift unexpectedly. Worse because she could now see exactly how trapped she was. The boulder was massive, far larger than she had estimated by touch alone. Her leg disappeared beneath it completely, and she could see no obvious way to create the leverage needed to move such a weight. Sarah forced herself to remain calm and systematic. Panic would consume energy and oxygen that she couldn't afford to waste. She needed to approach this situation like the scientific problem it was, breaking it down into manageable components and testing potential solutions methodically. First priority, stop the bleeding, Sarah said aloud, applying first aid principles she had learned in wilderness medical training. She couldn't see the extent of her leg injuries, but she could feel warm blood soaking through her clothing. Using supplies from her first aid kit, Sarah applied pressure bandages to the areas she could reach, trying to control bleeding and stabilize her injuries. The pain was intense, but she forced herself to complete the medical care that might keep her alive long enough for rescue to arrive. Second priority, conserve body heat. Sarah continued her survival checklist. The cave's constant 50-degree temperature was comfortable for hiking, but dangerous for someone who couldn't. Hypothermia would become a serious threat within hours if she couldn't maintain her core body temperature. Sarah pulled extra clothing from her pack and wrapped herself as thoroughly as possible, while still maintaining access to her trapped leg. She knew that staying warm would be crucial for her body's ability to heal from her injuries and fight off potential infections. Third priority, signal for rescue. Sarah said, though this was where her situation became most desperate. Her radio was distraught, her cell phone had no signal 400 feet underground, and her backup emergency whistle would never be heard through hundreds of feet of solid rock. Sarah did have emergency flares in her pack, but using them in the confined space of the crevice would be dangerous and likely ineffective. The smoke would have nowhere to go, and the light would not be visible from the chamber above, much less from the surface. They'll come looking, Sarah told herself with forced confidence. When I miss my check-in, they'll initiate search protocol. Mark knows my route, knows where I was working. They'll find me. But Sarah's scientific mind was already calculating the challenges facing any rescue operation. The collapse that had trapped her would have changed the configuration of the chamber floor. Rescuers might not immediately realize that she had fallen into a crevice. Even if they found the collapse site, it could take hours or days to determine how to safely extract her from beneath the boulder. How long can I survive down here? Sarah asked herself, applying the same analytical thinking she used for geological research. Limited food and water, approximately 72 hours maximum. Injury complications could reduce that significantly. Hypothermia risk increases over time. Psychological factors. Unknown. The psychological factors were perhaps the most concerning aspect of Sarah's situation. She had never experienced sensory deprivation this complete or isolation, this absolute. The darkness was so total that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on her consciousness. The silence was so profound that she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Keep talking, Sarah instructed herself. Maintain verbal contact. Keep your mind engaged. Don't let the isolation win. Sarah began reciting geological formations from memory, describing cave systems she had explored, reviewing the scientific literature on karst geology, anything to keep her mind active and prevent the descent into despair that could be as fatal as her physical injuries. Mammoth Cave System, approximately 400 miles of mapped passages, formed primarily in Mississippian limestone, created by carbonic acid dissolution over approximately 10 million years. As Sarah recited scientific facts, she was also listening carefully to the sounds around her. Cave acoustics could carry sounds for considerable distances, and she hoped to hear some indication that rescue efforts were beginning above her. But the only sounds were her own voice and the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the darkness. The cave system that had been her life's passion had become her potential tomb, and the silence seemed to mock her hopes for rescue. Sarah was beginning to understand that her survival would depend not just on her physical condition or her scientific knowledge, but on her ability to maintain hope in a situation where hope seemed completely irrational. The real test of her endurance was just beginning. Hour 6. Sarah had been trapped in the crevice for 3.5 hours, and the reality of her situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The pain in her crushed leg had evolved from sharp agony to a deep, throbbing ache that suggested serious vascular damage. Her backup flashlight was dimming, forcing her to ration light like a precious resource. Most concerning, she had missed her scheduled check-in by over 2 hours. Sarah knew that emergency protocols would have been initiated by now, but she also understood the challenges facing any rescue operation in a cave system as complex as Mammoth Cave. "They're looking for me," Sarah said aloud, her voice echoing in the narrow space. "Mark knows my route, knows my target chamber. They'll start with the most obvious locations and work systematically through possibilities." But Sarah's scientific training forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about cave rescue operations. Even with experienced teams and specialized equipment, locating a trapped victim in hundreds of miles of cave passages could take days or weeks. And Sarah didn't have days or weeks. Sarah's water supplies were limited to 2 bottles. She had carried for her research trip approximately 32 ounces total. In normal conditions, that might sustain her for perhaps 48 hours. But trapped in a position where she couldn't move, with injuries that were causing blood loss, and in the stress of an emergency situation, her body's water requirements would be higher than normal. Need to ration water carefully, Sarah calculated. Small sips, frequent intervals, monitor for signs of dehydration. Make it last as long as possible. Sarah's food supplies consisted of energy bars designed for hiking high-calorie, compact nutrition that could theoretically sustain her for several days if rationed properly. But appetite was difficult to maintain when dealing with severe pain and the psychological stress of entrapment. "Eat something," Sarah commanded herself, forcing down small bites of an energy bar, despite her lack of hunger. "Maintain blood sugar, maintain energy levels. Your body needs fuel to heal and to fight." But Sarah's most immediate concern was the progressive loss of feeling in her trapped leg. The boulder's weight was cutting off circulation, and she could feel her foot becoming increasingly numb. Without blood flow, tissue death would begin within hours, followed by systemic toxicity that could be fatal even if rescue arrived. "Need to try moving the boulder again," Sarah said, though her previous attempts had been completely unsuccessful. Maybe different approach, different leverage point, using her rock hammer as a lever and a smaller stone as a fulcrum. Sarah attempted to create mechanical advantage that might shift the massive boulder even slightly. The physics were working against her. The boulder was wedged tightly between the crevice walls, and she could only apply force from limited angles. Sarah strained against the rock hammer until her muscles cramped and her hands bled, but the boulder remained immovable. 800 pounds of limestone, positioned with the mechanical advantage of a wedge, was simply beyond her ability to move with improvised tools. "Think," Sarah, she coached herself, fighting off the despair that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. "You're a geologist. You understand rock mechanics, structural engineering, physics. There has to be a solution." Sarah began examining the boulder and the crevice walls more systematically, looking for structural weaknesses that might be exploited. Limestone was a relatively soft rock that could be chipped or fractured under the right conditions. Perhaps she could break away pieces of the boulder rather than trying to move it entirely. Using her rock hammer, Sarah began chipping away at the boulder where it contacted her leg, trying to create space that might allow her to pull free. It was exhausting work that consumed precious energy, and progress was measured in millimeters rather than inches. "Every chip counts," Sarah muttered as she worked. Persistence over time. Geological processes work slowly but inevitably. Water cuts through mountains given enough time. But time was Sarah's enemy as much as the boulder. With each passing hour, her physical condition deteriorated further. The trapped leg was completely numb now, a medical emergency that could result in amputation, even if rescue arrived immediately. Sarah's psychological state was also being tested by the extreme sensory deprivation. The absolute darkness and silence created hallucinations. She thought she heard voices calling her name, saw lights that weren't there, and had conversations with people who existed only in her increasingly desperate mind. "Stay rational," Sarah told herself when she realized She had been talking to her deceased grandmother for several minutes. Hallucinations are normal in sensory deprivation. Don't trust what you see or hear unless you can verify it. Hour 12. Sarah had been trapped for half a day, and her situation was becoming critical. Her water supplies were down to less than 16 ounces. Her food was lasting longer, but her appetite was minimal due to pain and stress. Most concerning, her core body temperature was dropping, despite her efforts to stay warm. Hypothermia is setting in, Sarah diagnosed clinically. Need to generate heat, need to move the parts of my body I can still control. Sarah began a routine of isometric exercises, tensing and relaxing the muscles she could still control to generate heat and maintain circulation. It was painful and exhausting, but necessary for survival. The exercises also served a psychological purpose. They gave Sarah something to do, a sense of control in a situation where she was largely helpless. Action, even ineffective action, was better than passive waiting for rescue or death. Rescue teams are working methodically, Sarah told herself during one of her exercise sessions. They'll start with the most likely areas and expand their search systematically. They have my route. They know my target chamber. They'll find the collapse eventually, but eventually might be too late. Sarah was beginning to understand that her survival was not just about waiting for rescue. It was about finding ways to survive long enough for rescue to have meaning. Hour 18. Sarah had been trapped for 3/4 of a day, and she was entering what survival experts call the critical phase, the point where multiple body systems begin to fail simultaneously, creating a cascade of medical emergencies that can be fatal even with prompt treatment. Her trapped leg showed no signs of circulation. Her core body temperature had dropped several degrees, despite her efforts to stay warm. Her thinking was becoming cloudy and confused, a sign of both hypothermia and the psychological stress of extreme isolation. Need to stay focused, Sarah said aloud, though her voice was weaker than it had been hours earlier. Need to keep fighting. People are looking for me. Rescue is coming. But Sarah's scientific mind was calculating probabilities that her heart didn't want to accept. Cave rescue operations were complex and time-consuming. Even if searchers found her location quickly, extracting her safely from beneath the boulder could take many additional hours. How long can I hold on? Sarah whispered into the darkness. It was a question she had been avoiding, but one that demanded an honest answer. The medical reality was stark. Severe hypothermia, progressive dehydration, possible internal bleeding from crush injuries, and the beginning stages of systemic toxicity from tissue death in her trapped leg. Without immediate medical intervention, she might have hours rather than days left to live. But Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent her entire career studying the Earth's most enduring processes. She understood that persistence and time could overcome seemingly immovable obstacles. Mountains could be worn down by raindrops. Oceans could be carved by streams. I'm not giving up, Sarah said with determination that came from somewhere deeper than rational calculation. I survived the initial fall. I survived the first 18 hours. I can survive whatever comes next. It was a commitment that would be tested beyond anything Sarah had ever imagined, because her ordeal was far from over. The darkest hours, literally and figuratively, still lay ahead. Hour 24. Sarah had been trapped in the crevice for exactly 1 day, and her mind was beginning to play tricks on her in ways that were both terrifying and oddly comforting. The complete sensory deprivation, combined with pain, hypothermia, and sleep deprivation, was creating hallucinations that seemed absolutely real. Sarah, can you hear me? The voice seemed to come from directly above her, clear and urgent. Sarah's heart raced with hope. I'm here, I'm down here, help me. She screamed until her throat was raw, straining to hear a response. But after several minutes of silence, Sarah realized with crushing disappointment that the voice had been another hallucination, her brain's desperate attempt to create the rescue that hadn't come. Stay rational, Sarah coached herself, though her voice was barely a whisper now. Distinguish between real and imaginary. Don't let the hallucinations consume energy you need for survival. But the hallucinations were becoming more frequent and more vivid. Sarah found herself having elaborate conversations with her research colleagues, her family members, and even people she hadn't seen in years. Part of her mind understood that these conversations weren't real, but another part was grateful for the company, even imaginary company. The most frequent visitor was her grandfather, who had introduced Sarah to caving when she was 12 years old. He appeared to her as clearly as if he were sitting beside her in the crevice, offering comfort and encouragement in his familiar voice. "You're tougher than you think, Sarah girl," her grandfather seemed to say. "Remember when you got lost in Crystal Cave when you were 14? You found your way out then, and you'll find your way out now." "That was different," Grandpa Sarah replied aloud, not caring anymore whether the conversation was real or imaginary. "I wasn't trapped under a boulder then. I wasn't injured and running out of time. Time's not up until you say it's up," her grandfather's voice seemed to reply. "Keep fighting. Keep thinking. Keep believing that rescue is possible." These conversations with hallucinated figures served an important psychological function. They helped Sarah maintain verbal communication and rational thinking when the isolation threatened to drive her into complete despair. Even if the voices weren't real, the thoughts and encouragement they provided were helping her survive. But Sarah's physical condition continued to deteriorate. Her water supplies were down to perhaps 8 ounces less than a day's worth under normal conditions, maybe 2 days if she rationed it carefully. Her trapped leg was completely without sensation now, a medical emergency that would require immediate amputation if rescue arrived. Compartment syndrome. Sarah, diagnosed with clinical detachment, crushing injury causing swelling within muscle compartments, cutting off blood supply, tissue death, probable systemic toxicity. Even if I'm rescued, I might lose the leg. The thought of amputation was terrifying, but Sarah forced herself to accept it as a possibility. Losing a leg was preferable to losing her life, and she needed to focus on survival rather than dwelling on potential disabilities. Sarah's core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, despite her efforts to stay warm. She was shivering constantly now, her body's attempt to generate heat through muscle activity. But shivering consumed calories and energy that she couldn't afford to waste. "Need to try a different approach to staying warm," Sarah reasoned through chattering teeth. "Reduce exposed surface area, create dead airspace for insulation." Sarah used her remaining clothing and equipment to create a makeshift shelter within the crevice, trying to trap her body heat in a smaller space. It wasn't much, but every degree of temperature retention could extend her survival time. Hour 30. Sarah had been trapped for more than a day and a quarter, well beyond the time frame when rescue should have arrived, if it was going to arrive at all. The rational part of her mind was beginning to calculate the probability that she would die in this crevice, 400 feet underground, without ever seeing daylight again. "Maybe they can't find me," Sarah whispered into the darkness. "Maybe the collapse covered the entrance to this crevice. Maybe they're searching in the wrong areas." It was a terrifying possibility that Sarah had been trying not to consider. If the collapse had sealed the entrance to her crevice, or if the debris had camouflaged her location so thoroughly that searchers couldn't detect it, she might never be found. Even the most dedicated rescue teams couldn't search every square foot of a cave system as vast and complex as Mammoth Cave. "Need to make noise," Sarah decided, though her voice was weak from dehydration and hypothermia. "Need to signal somehow when searchers are nearby." Sarah began a systematic program of noise making, using her rock hammer to tap against the limestone walls in patterns that might be detectable by rescue teams with sensitive listening equipment. She tapped the international distress signal 3 short, 3 long, 3 short whenever she had the energy. But Sarah's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her water supplies were exhausted. Her emergency food was nearly gone. Most critically, Her core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, despite her efforts to stay warm in the constant 50-degree cave environment. Hour 48. Sarah had been trapped for 2 full days, and she was beginning to experience the disorientation and confusion that indicated severe hypothermia. Her speech was slurred when she talked to herself. Her thinking was becoming increasingly scattered, and she was having difficulty remembering basic survival procedures. "Need to stay awake," Sarah mumbled, though the words were barely intelligible. "Hypothermia makes you sleepy. Sleep means death." Sarah forced herself to continue her isometric exercises, tensing and relaxing muscles to generate heat and maintain circulation. But the exercises were becoming less effective as her energy reserves depleted, and the effort required to perform them was consuming calories she couldn't afford to waste. Hour 60. Sarah had been trapped for 2.5 days, and she was entering the final stages of hypothermia. Her shivering had stopped not because she was warmer, but because her body no longer had the energy to generate heat through muscle activity. Her pulse was slow and irregular. Her breathing was shallow and labored. Most dangerously, Sarah was beginning to experience the paradoxical warmth that often preceded death from hypothermia. Her confused brain was interpreting her body's shutdown as comfort rather than crisis. "Feels warmer now," Sarah said with a dreamy smile that would have terrified anyone who understood hypothermia symptoms. "Maybe I can rest for a while." It was at this moment, when Sarah was perhaps an hour away from losing consciousness permanently, that rescue finally arrived. The sound that saved Sarah's life was almost inaudible. The faint scraping of equipment against rock, transmitted through hundreds of feet of solid limestone from the chamber above. Sarah's hypothermic brain initially dismissed it as another hallucination, but some primitive survival instinct forced her to listen more carefully. "Real sound," Sarah whispered, her voice barely functional. "Different from the others." Sarah summoned every remaining ounce of strength to tap against the limestone wall with her rock hammer. The sound was weak and irregular, but it was detectable by the sensitive acoustic equipment that the rescue team was using to scan the collapsed area. Above ground, the rescue operation had been running continuously for over 2 days. Captain Jennifer Hayes of the Kentucky Cave Rescue Team was coordinating the most complex underground search and rescue operation in the region's history, involving over 40 specialists from multiple agencies. "We're getting acoustic hits from grid section C7, reported Dr. Michael Chen, the acoustic specialist operating listening equipment that could detect sounds through solid rock. "Very faint, but rhythmic. Could be human-generated." Captain Hayes had been hoping for exactly this kind of breakthrough. The acoustic searches had detected no signs of life for the first 48 hours, leading many team members to conclude that Dr. Mitchell had died in the initial collapse or from injuries sustained during the fall. "Response pattern analysis," Captain Hayes ordered. "If there's someone alive down there, they should respond to our signals." The rescue team began transmitting acoustic signals into the rock formation, carefully controlled impacts that would be audible to anyone trapped in void spaces below. They used a specific pattern: 3 impacts, pause, 3 impacts, pause, 3 impacts. The international distress signal. Sarah heard the signals clearly despite her hypothermic confusion. The sounds were too organized, too purposeful to be natural cave acoustics or equipment noise. Someone was trying to communicate with her. Sarah responded with her own tapping pattern, using the same 333 sequence to indicate that she was alive and could receive their signals. The effort required to tap coherently consumed most of her remaining energy, but she understood that this might be her only chance to establish communication with rescuer. "Confirmed response, Dr. Chen reported excitedly. "Someone is alive down there and responding to our signals. The response pattern matches our transmission pattern exactly." The confirmation that Sarah was alive transformed the rescue operation from a recovery mission to a desperate race against time. Acoustic communication had established her approximate location, but reaching her would require careful excavation through unstable debris that could collapse further and crush her. Structural assessment, Captain Hayes ordered. How do we reach the victim without causing a secondary collapse? Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the structural engineer attached to the rescue team, had been studying the collapse site for 2 days, analyzing the forces involved and the stability of the remaining debris. Her assessment was sobering. The victim appears to be in a void space, approximately 12 feet below the current debris surface. Dr. Rodriguez reported, the debris pile is inherently unstable. Any excavation could trigger additional collapse. We need to approach this like a demolition project in reverse. The rescue plan that emerged was unprecedented in cave rescue history. Instead of digging straight down to Sarah's location, the team would create a parallel shaft through solid rock, then tunnel horizontally to reach her crevice from the side. It would take longer than direct excavation, but it would be much safer for both Sarah and the rescue workers. Time estimate for horizontal access, Captain Hayes asked. Minimum 8 hours with pneumatic tools and experienced hard rock miners. Dr. Rodriguez calculated, possibly 12 hours if we encounter harder rock formations. 8 to 12 hours. Sarah had already been trapped for 60 hours, and her acoustic signals were becoming weaker and less frequent. Medical experts estimated that she might have only a few hours of consciousness remaining, and possibly less time before hypothermia became irreversible. We proceed with the horizontal access plan, Captain Hayes decided. Alert medical teams to prepare for severe hypothermia treatment. Alert mining contractors to mobilize their best hard rock crew immediately. The next phase of the rescue operation required specialized equipment and expertise that went far beyond normal cave rescue capabilities. A crew of experienced hard rock miners was brought in with pneumatic drilling equipment, along with engineers who specialized in underground construction. This is like building a mine shaft in miniature, explained Jim Morrison, the lead miner who would supervise the drilling operation. We need to maintain precise direction and grade, shore up the tunnel as we go, and break through to the victim's location without causing a collapse. Sarah, trapped in her crevice 12 feet below, could hear the sounds of drilling and excavation beginning above her. The noise was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it meant rescue was actively in progress. Terrifying because the vibrations could potentially destabilize her already precarious shelter. Hold on, Dr. Mitchell, Captain Hayes called down through a small communication hole they had managed to establish. We're coming to get you. Stay awake and keep responding to our signals. Sarah tried to respond, but her voice was too weak to carry up through the rock. She managed to tap weakly with her hammer, a sound that was barely detectable, but proved she was still conscious and fighting. The horizontal drilling operation was a masterpiece of precision engineering. The miners worked in shifts, maintaining continuous progress, while carefully monitoring the stability of the surrounding rock. Every few feet, they installed steel supports to prevent tunnel collapse. Every hour, they checked Sarah's condition through acoustic communication. Hour 70, the rescue tunnel had progressed 8 feet towards Sarah's location, with approximately 4 feet remaining. But Sarah's responses to acoustic signals were becoming increasingly weak and infrequent. Medical personnel monitoring the situation estimated that she was in the final stages of severe hypothermia. She's running out of time, Dr. Patricia Walsh, the emergency physician, coordinating medical aspects of the rescue, reported to Captain Hayes. Even if we reach her in the next few hours, she may be too far gone for resuscitation. But the rescue team refused to give up. They had committed to bringing Sarah out alive, and they would continue their efforts until success, or until it became absolutely clear that she was beyond help. Hour 75, the drilling crew broke through into Sarah's crevice with a precision that amazed even experienced mining engineers. The breakthrough created a tunnel just large enough for a person to crawl through, connecting the rescue shaft to the void space where Sarah had been trapped for over 3 days. Dr. James Miller, a physician with extensive cave rescue experience, was the first person to reach Sarah's location. What he found when he crawled through the rescue tunnel was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Sarah was barely conscious, her body positioned in a way that had allowed her to survive for over 3 days in conditions that should have been fatal within hours. She had used every piece of survival knowledge she possessed, every tool at her disposal, and every ounce of determination to stay alive until rescue could reach her. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Miller," he said as he began emergency medical assessment. "We're here to take you home." Sarah's response was barely a whisper, but it was coherent. "Knew you'd come. Just had to hold on." The extraction of Sarah from her underground prison required another 4 hours of careful work. Her condition was so severe that moving her too quickly could trigger cardiac arrest, while leaving her in the cave any longer could result in irreversible hypothermia damage. Dr. Miller worked in the confined space of the crevice to stabilize Sarah's condition before extraction. He administered warm Roman 4 fluids to begin rewarming her core temperature, provided oxygen to help her damaged circulation, and carefully immobilized her injured leg to prevent further damage during transport. "Core temperature is 84 degrees, Dr. Miller reported to the medical team above. "Severe hypothermia, dehydration, probable frostbite to extremities, and significant crush injuries to the right leg. She's alive, but we need to get her to trauma surgery immediately." The process of moving Sarah through the rescue tunnel was agonizingly slow. She had to be secured to a specialized rescue stretcher, pulled through the narrow horizontal shaft, then lifted up the vertical rescue shaft to the cave chamber above. Every movement caused her pain, but she remained conscious and cooperative throughout the process. "Almost there, Dr. Mitchell." The rescue workers encouraged her as they navigated the final obstacles. "You're doing great. Just a little bit further." When Sarah finally emerged from the underground chamber, after 127 hours of entrapment, she was greeted by a team of medical specialists, rescue coordinators, and cave experts who had worked around the clock to save her life. The sight of daylight, even filtered through the cave entrance, was overwhelming after more than 5 days in absolute darkness. "Sunlight," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face as she was carried toward the cave entrance. "I never thought I'd see sunlight again." Sarah's transport to the hospital required helicopter evacuation, since ground transport would have taken too long for someone in her critical condition. The flight crew was prepared for a patient with severe hypothermia and trauma injuries, but they were amazed by Sarah's alertness and mental clarity. Most people with hypothermia this severe are unconscious or delirious, noted flight nurse Rebecca Santos, as she monitored Sarah's condition during transport. "Her survival instincts and will to live are extraordinary." At the hospital, Sarah underwent immediate surgery to repair her crushed leg and treat the complications of prolonged cold exposure. The surgical team worked for 8 hours to restore circulation to her damaged limb and remove tissue that had been damaged beyond repair. "We were able to save the leg," Dr. Patricia Chen, the orthopedic surgeon, reported to Sarah's family after the operation. "There will be permanent damage, and she'll require extensive rehabilitation, but she should eventually regain most of her mobility." Sarah's recovery from 5 days of underground entrapment was slow and challenging. In addition to her physical injuries, she experienced psychological effects from the extreme isolation and near-death experience, but her scientific training and analytical mindset helped her process the trauma in a healthy way. "I learned things about myself that I never would have discovered under normal circumstances," Sarah told the psychologist who was helping with her recovery. "I found out that I'm much stronger than I thought I was, both physically and mentally." Sarah's survival story attracted international attention from both the scientific community and the general public. Cave rescue experts studied her case to understand how someone could survive so long in conditions that were typically fatal within hours. Dr. Mitchell's survival rewrites our understanding of what's possible in extreme cave entrapment scenarios, explained Dr. David Kim, director of the National Cave Rescue Commission. Her knowledge, preparation, and psychological resilience created a perfect storm of survival factors. But Sarah was most interested in using her experience to improve cave safety and rescue capabilities. She worked with rescue organizations to develop better communication protocols, improved emergency equipment, and enhanced training programs for cave researchers. My survival was partly due to luck, but mostly due to the incredible efforts of the rescue team, Sarah said during a presentation to cave rescue specialists. We need to make sure that other trapped cavers don't have to rely on luck. 6 months after her rescue, Sarah returned to cave research, though with modified safety protocols and a deeper appreciation for the risks involved in underground exploration. Her near-death experience had not diminished her passion for geology. It had intensified her understanding of the cave environment and her respect for its dangers. The cave didn't try to kill me, Sarah explained to colleagues who questioned her return to underground research. I made a mistake, and the cave environment revealed that mistake in a dramatic way. But caves are still the most fascinating geological environments on Earth. Sarah's research focus shifted toward developing better safety equipment and emergency protocols for cave scientists. Her experience as a trapped victim gave her unique insights into what equipment and procedures were most important for survival in extreme underground conditions. 2 years after her 127-hour ordeal, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had become one of the world's leading experts on cave emergency survival. Her experience had transformed her from a victim of circumstances into an advocate for improved safety and a teacher of survival techniques that could save other lives. Sarah's survival manual, Trapped, a scientist's guide to underground emergency survival, became required reading for cave researchers, rescue teams, and adventure cavers around the world. The manual combined scientific knowledge with practical survival techniques, all informed by Sarah's real-world experience of what works when everything goes wrong. Traditional cave safety focuses on prevention, Sarah explained during training sessions for cave rescue teams. But prevention sometimes fails. When it does, you need to know how to survive until rescue can reach you. Sarah's techniques for psychological survival in extreme isolation were particularly valuable for rescue organizations. Many cave entrapment victims died not from their injuries or environmental exposure, but from panic and despair that led to poor decision-making. The mind is your most important survival tool, Sarah taught in her courses. Everything else, equipment, techniques, even physical condition, depends on maintaining mental clarity and emotional stability. Sarah also worked with equipment manufacturers to develop better emergency gear for cave exploration. Her suggestions led to improvements in cave rescue beacon, emergency shelters, and hypothermia prevention equipment. Dr. Mitchell's input has revolutionized cave safety equipment, noted Dr. Alan Foster, director of the Cave Research Foundation. Her recommendations are based on actual survival experience, not just theoretical considerations. But perhaps Sarah's most important contribution was her demonstration that extreme survival was possible through knowledge, preparation, and refusal to give up. Her story inspired not just cavers, but anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges. Sarah's survival proves that humans are capable of enduring far more than we typically imagine, observed Dr. Lisa Park, a psychologist who studied extreme survival cases. Her experience shows that preparation, knowledge, and mental toughness can overcome conditions that appear to be unsurvivable. Sarah received hundreds of letters from people who credited her story with helping them through their own difficult situations. Cancer patients undergoing treatment, accident victims facing long recoveries, and people dealing with various life crises found inspiration in her example of holding on when hope seemed lost. Your story taught me that giving up is always an option, but it's never the only option, wrote one correspondent. When my situation seemed hopeless, I thought about you trapped in that cave, and I decided to keep fighting. Sarah's experience also led to improvements in cave rescue protocols and equipment. The horizontal drilling technique used to reach her became a standard approach for similar entrapment scenarios, and the communication methods developed during her rescue were adopted by cave rescue organizations internationally. 5 years after her rescue, Sarah was invited to speak at the International Cave Rescue Conference, where she was recognized not just as a survival expert, but as someone whose experience had advanced the entire field of underground emergency response. Sarah Mitchell's survival and subsequent contributions have saved lives around the world, said Captain Jennifer Hayes, who had coordinated Sarah's rescue and had since become director of the International Cave Rescue Association. Her ordeal was transformed into knowledge that benefits everyone who explores underground environments. Sarah's presentation at the conference focused not on the details of her survival, but on the broader lessons her experience offered for anyone facing extreme challenges. Survival is not about being superhuman, Sarah told the audience. It's about using whatever knowledge, tools, and resources you have available, combined with absolute refusal to accept defeat. Anyone can learn these skills. Sarah's story had also influenced academic research into human survival capabilities. Universities studying extreme psychology, survival medicine, and human adaptation incorporated her case into their curricula as an example of what was possible when preparation met crisis. Dr. Mitchell's survival represents a convergence of factors that we're still studying, explained Dr. Robert Chen, director of the Human Survival Research Institute. Her scientific training, her psychological resilience, and her practical survival knowledge created a unique case study in human adaptation. But for Sarah herself, the most meaningful aspect of her experience was not the recognition or the scientific contributions. It was the profound change in her perspective on life and what truly mattered. Being trapped in that cave for 5 days taught me that every day above ground is a gift, Sarah reflected. Every sunrise, every conversation with friends, every moment of warmth and safety, none of it is guaranteed. My survival taught me to appreciate the ordinary miracles of everyday life. Sarah's relationship with caves had evolved from professional interest to something approaching spiritual connection. She understood that the underground world was not hostile to human life, but it was indifferent to human survival in ways that demanded respect and preparation. Caves are neutral, Sarah often told her students. They're not trying to help you or hurt you. They simply exist according to physical laws that don't make exceptions for human needs. If you want to explore them safely, you need to understand and respect those laws. 10 years after her rescue, Sarah was still actively involved in cave research, though she had expanded her focus to include public education about cave safety and the importance of underground conservation. Her near-death experience had given her a platform to advocate for the protection of cave environments and the scientific knowledge they contain. Caves are irreplaceable scientific resources, Sarah argued in her conservation advocacy. They contain geological records, unique ecosystems, and archaeological artifacts that can't be found anywhere else. But they are also dangerous environments that require proper training and respect. Sarah's survival story had become a legend in the caving community, but she was careful to emphasize that her experience was not unique in its fundamental elements. Anyone could learn the skills and develop the mindset that had enabled her survival. "I'm not special," Sarah insisted when asked about her remarkable endurance. "I just refused to give up, and I used every tool and technique available to me." Those are choices that anyone can make when facing extreme circumstances. As we reach the end of Dr. Sarah Mitchell's incredible 127-hour survival story, it's crucial to understand that her ordeal represents far more than just an amazing tale of endurance in a cave. Sarah's story is a powerful testament to the human capacity to survive the unsurvivable through knowledge, preparation, and absolute refusal to surrender when surrender seems like the only rational choice. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was not superhuman. She was not a professional survival expert with decades of wilderness training. She was a scientist who found herself in a situation that should have been fatal within hours, and who survived for more than 5 days through a combination of scientific knowledge, practical skills, and unbreakable determination to see daylight again. Sarah's survival was built on several fundamental principles that apply to any extreme situation. First, that knowledge is the ultimate survival tool. Sarah's geological training helped her understand the structure of her underground prison and assess the risks of different survival strategies. Her first aid knowledge allowed her to treat her injuries and manage her physical condition. Her understanding of hypothermia helped her recognize the symptoms and take countermeasures that kept her alive. Second, that psychological strength is as important as physical endurance. Sarah's most dangerous enemy was not the cold, the darkness, or even her physical injuries. It was despair. The psychological challenge of maintaining hope in absolute darkness while trapped and in pain, with no guarantee that rescue would ever come, required mental toughness that few people ever have to develop. Third, that proper preparation multiplies your chances of survival exponentially. Sarah's survival equipment, though minimal, included items that proved crucial to her endurance. Her emergency supplies, combined with her knowledge of how to use them effectively, gave her the tools she needed to survive until rescue could reach her. Fourth, that the decision to never give up is often the single most important factor in survival. Sarah had multiple opportunities to surrender to despair, to accept that her situation was hopeless, to stop fighting and let hypothermia carry her into unconsciousness and death. Each time, she chose to continue fighting, even when fighting seemed pointless. Sarah's story also demonstrates the incredible power of human ingenuity under extreme stress. Trapped in a space smaller than a phone booth, with limited supplies and tools, Sarah found ways to maintain her body temperature, manage her injuries, signal for rescue, and maintain her psychological stability for more than 5 days. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's survival proves that the limits we think we have are often just limits we've accepted, not limits that actually exist. Medical science suggested that survival in her conditions should have been impossible. Sarah proved that impossible is often just another word for untested. Sarah's experience changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who have learned from her example. Her survival techniques have been incorporated into training programs for cave rescuers, underground workers, and anyone who might face similar entrapment scenarios. Her story has inspired people facing their own impossible circumstances to hold on when giving up seemed like the only option. Sarah Mitchell showed us that the human spirit is stronger than any physical obstacle, said one rescue worker who participated in her extraction. Her survival reminded us that our job is never to give up on someone, no matter how impossible the situation seems. The rescue operation that saved Sarah's life was itself a testament to the power of refusing to accept defeat. The 40 rescue workers who spent over 3 days extracting her from an underground crevice could have concluded that she was dead after the first 24 hours. Instead, they continued their efforts based on the belief that she might still be alive, and that belief ultimately saved her life. Sarah's story teaches us that in our own lives, When we face situations that seem hopeless, when the challenges appear insurmountable, when giving up seems like the only rational choice, we have the same options that Sarah had in that underground crevice. We can surrender to despair, or we can use whatever knowledge and resources we have available to fight for survival. We can accept that our situation is impossible, or we can refuse to believe that impossible is the final answer. We can conserve our energy by giving up, or we can spend that energy finding creative solutions to seemingly unsolvable problems. We can focus on how hopeless our circumstances are, or we can focus on what we can control and influence. Most importantly, we can choose to hold on to life, to hope, to the belief that human ingenuity and determination can overcome any obstacle, even when holding on requires us to dig deeper than we ever thought possible. Dr. Sarah Mitchell spent 127 hours trapped 400 feet underground, pinned beneath a massive boulder, in complete darkness, with no guarantee that anyone would ever find her. She survived because she refused to accept that her situation was hopeless, because she used every tool and technique available to her, and because she held on to life and hope when both seemed irrational. Her story proves that no matter what challenges we face, no matter how impossible our circumstances seem, holding on is always possible. Sometimes holding on is difficult. Sometimes it requires us to use knowledge and skills we didn't know we possessed. Sometimes it demands that we fight against our own rational mind, which tells us that surrender would be easier. But Sarah Mitchell's 127 hours underground proved that holding on when everything else has failed, when hope seems lost, when the logical choice would be to give up, is often the one thing that makes the difference between survival and surrender. As we conclude this episode of Hold On, Survival Stories, remember Sarah's example. When you face your own impossible circumstances, remember that humans are capable of surviving far more than we typically imagine. Remember that knowledge, preparation, and mental toughness can overcome conditions that appear unsurvivable. And remember that sometimes, when everything seems lost, the only thing you can do is what Sarah Mitchell did in that underground crevice. Hold on. Hold on to knowledge. Hold on to hope. Hold on to the belief that survival is possible. Hold on to life itself, even when life seems impossible to sustain. Hold on to the understanding that human determination can overcome any obstacle, because sometimes holding on long enough allows rescue to reach you. Sometimes holding on reveals strength you never knew you had. And sometimes holding on transforms an impossible situation into a survival story that inspires others to hold on when they face their own moments of despair. Sarah Mitchell held on for 127 hours in conditions that should have been fatal, and emerged not just as a survivor, but as someone who had proven that the human spirit is stronger than any physical prison, more persistent than any obstacle, and more powerful than any force that tries to break it. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Hold On, Survival Stories. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's 127 hours underground remind us all that when faced with impossible circumstances, the choice to hold on is the choice that can transform victims into survivors, despair into hope, and impossible situations into incredible stories of human resilience. Until next time, remember, no matter how trapped you feel, no matter how dark your situation, no matter how impossible escape seems, you have the capacity to hold on, to fight, and to survive until rescue reaches you, or until you find your own way to freedom. Keep holding on.